Old Platte Bridge was located on the south side of the North Platte River, about 130 miles west of Fort Laramie. The station was a stockade, inside of which were accommodations for a garrison of about 100 men. About 15 rods, 240 feet, northwest of the station was a bridge about 100 feet long. Nearly half a mile west of the bridge, on the north side of the river, a deep gulch came down from the north to the river. After crossing the bridge, the road took a northwesterly course over the bottomland, up to the bluff, along the edge of which it ran for a mile or two in plain sight of the river and station. The telegraph line ran along on the side of the road. The country north of the road was covered with sand hills and deep ravines. At the time of the attack, July 26, 1865, the place was garrisoned by Company I of the 11th Kansas Cavalry, 2 of the 11th Ohio, and about 12 of the U.S. infantry, who were rebel prisoners, who enlisted in the United States service to fight Indians, in preference to staying in military prisons. The headquarters of the 11th Kansas Regiment were also at the station, making about 110 men, all under the command of Major M. Anderson of the 11th Kansas. Of these men, about 70 or 80 had guns, the rest being armed with revolvers. Company I were armed with Smith breech-loading carbines. The 11th Ohio Boys had Spencer repeating carbines, and the U.S. infantry, or galvanized troops, as the boys called them, used the Springfield musket. Just after dinner on the 25th of July, 1865, someone called out, "Indians!" and all hands, seizing their arms, ran out to see where they were. On the north side of the river, about 15 or 20 Indians, on horseback, were moving leisurely along. In a few minutes, about a dozen men were mounted, and crossing the bridge, they commenced skirmishing with the enemy. As fast as our men moved on, the Indians fell back, until our men had gone about 3 miles from the bridge. All this time, the Indians were increasing in numbers, until there were about 40 in plain sight. Our boys had been using their carbines with good effect and had shot several Indians off their ponies, without any particular loss or damage on our side. At this time, an order was received from the station for the men to come back, as the Indians were showing themselves on the south side of the river, east of the station. As our men fell back toward the bridge, Indians kept coming out of the ravine, until there were about 50 in sight, showing that their maneuvering had been for the purpose of leading our men as far away from all support as possible, and then to wipe them out by superior numbers. Our men reached the station without any loss. On the south side of the river, the boys were having about the same experience as their comrades on the north side. The Indians, falling back as they were charged, and gradually increasing in numbers. In one of the charges, the boys shot a Cheyenne chief through the bowels. He threw his arm over the neck of his pony, which wheeled to the left and went into a thicket of brush, where the chief fell off. At this time, the Indians charged desperately on our men to drive them back. But at this juncture, a reinforcement of about a dozen men came up from the station, and the Indians were repulsed. The intention had been to hold our men back long enough to give them an opportunity to carry off their fallen chief. 2 of the boys rode into the thicket and found the chief lying apparently dead. One man jumped off his horse and stabbed the Indian about the heart. He did not give the least sign of life. Then the trooper commenced to scalp him. As soon as the knife touched his head, the Indian began to beg, when another man shot him through the brain. The Indian's belief is that if a warrior loses his scalp, he cannot go to the happy hunting ground. Indians will lose their lives without the least sign of fear, but want to save their scalps. The boys took the chief's arms and a buckskin jacket he had on. The jacket was trimmed with about 35 different kinds of hair: white men's, women's and children's, Indians and squaws, which he had taken at different times in his battles and forays. A word right here in regard to the action of the man in stabbing and shooting the wounded Indian. About 10 days before this, the Indians had captured one of our men and had tortured and mangled his body in a shocking manner. Our boys swore that if they ever got hold of an Indian, they would cut him all to pieces, and they did as stated. The fight on the 25th of July, 1865, at Platte Bridge had resulted in the killing and wounding of several of the Indians, but with very little damage to our side. Several of our men had received slight wounds, but everyone reported for duty on their return to the stockade that evening, and all hands felt elated over the action. On making an inspection that evening of the arms and ammunition, it was found that there were less than 20 rounds per man for the Smith carbines, and but very little more for the other arms, owing to the oversight or neglect of someone whose business it was to attend to the ordnance supply. There had not been any cartridges for the Smith carbines sent out on the plains, save what the 11th Kansas Cavalry had on hand at the time of their departure from Fort Riley the preceding winter. A requisition had been made on the ordnance official at Fort Laramie, without success, and I presume he sent on our requisition to Fort Leavenworth. For a few days before, we had been notified by telegraph that supplies had been received, and that we should send an escort to Laramie with a requisition, and we would be provided for. At this time, Sergeant H. Todd and Corporal W. H. Smith, with some others, were on their way from Fort Laramie with commissary and ordnance supplies. But that did not help us out in the present crisis. Some of the boys commenced running bullets and making cartridges, Private James E. Bush being one I remember, who was very proficient in that line of work. During the night, an alarm was given by the sound of horses crossing the bridge, but on being challenged, we were agreeably surprised to find that it was caused by 5 or 6 of Company G, 11th Ohio Cavalry, under command of Lieutenant Brittany of the same company, from Sweetwater Station, about 50 miles west of Platte Bridge. They reported having left Sweetwater on the preceding morning in company with 3 wagons and 25 men of the 11th Kansas, under command of Sergeant Amos J. Custard of Company H. The train, with its escort, had halted about 18 or 20 miles from the bridge and proposed coming in as soon as possible the next day. They had seen no signs of Indians, either while with the train or since leaving it, and were surprised to find that they had not been attacked after we told them of the fighting during the afternoon. The next morning, July 26th, as soon as we could distinguish objects, we scanned the surrounding country to see if we could find any of our previous day's opponents. We did not make out any on our side of the river, but on the north side, there were some moving about, with others scattered on the hills. Altogether, there seemed to be about 90 in sight, just about the number we had been fighting the day before. They looked as if they were out of a job and did not know just where to find one. We breakfasted, and then Major Anderson ordered Lieutenant Casper Collins of the 11th Ohio Cavalry to take command of a detail of 25 men and reinforce the train to prevent their being surprised by the savages. Lieutenant Collins had been at Fort Laramie and was on his way back to his command at Sweetwater, and had reached Platte Bridge about 3 days before, with an escort of 4 or 5 men of Company K, 11th Kansas Cavalry, from Deer Creek, the next station east of us, about 30 miles. Lieutenant Collins was a son of ex-Governor Collins of Ohio, and had been out on the plains with his regiment for 2 or 3 years. He was a brave young fellow, and was considered to be pretty well posted in Indian tactics. The detail moved out in fine spirits, crossed the bridge, and then rode leisurely along the bottomland up onto the bluff. Quite a number of the boys had gone on foot over the bridge at the same time with the detail. Lieutenant Brittany of the 11th Ohio, with about a dozen men, had gone straight north up onto the bluff and was waiting to see what action the Indians would take with the detail. Strict orders had been given by Major Anderson that no shot was to be fired by our men unless it was actually necessary, on account of the shortage of ammunition. On reaching the top of the bluff, 2 Indians were seen by the detail at the top of the telegraph poles, a little over a quarter of a mile away, cutting the wires. As soon as they saw our men, they slid down the poles, mounted their ponies, and started for the backcountry as fast as the animals could carry them. Their mounts appeared to be very lame, and they did not appear to make much headway. It looked like a soft snap to take them in, and Lieutenant Collins ordered the boys to go for them, before the Indians could reach their friends. This charge, of course, took them off the road and away from the side of the river. The instant the last man disappeared from view, from behind the screen of willows west of the bridge, about 400 Cheyennes, on horseback, appeared and with loud yells, charged over the bottomland and up onto the bluff in the direction in which our men had gone. The instant they reached the top of the bluff, from behind every sandhill and out of every hollow, Indians appeared, all with the one object of charging on our detail and annihilating them before they could get back to the bridge and friends again. As soon as the detail realized the situation, they retraced their steps with all possible speed. It was not more than a couple of minutes before the Indians were all around them as thick as bees. In fact, so many of them were on all sides that they did not dare to use their firearms and bows and arrows for fear of shooting their own men, but used their lances, tomahawks, and spears, and even tried to pull the boys off their horses by main force. The boys kept together in two ranks, discharging their carbines with deadly effect into the crowd on their right and left. Then, not having time to reload, took their revolvers and kept up the shooting. A boy of about 17, belonging to Company I of the 11th Kansas, had what we call a muley or pepper box revolver, the hammer being on the underside of the weapon, and by pulling the trigger, the hammer would raise the piece, revolve to the next charge, and then the hammer would fall on the cap and fire it. A big Indian struck the boy over the head with his spear, trying to stun him, but the horses were moving so rapidly that it did not injure the boy very much. The youngster said he pointed his pepper box at the Indian, and the Indian, with a sardonic grin on his face, exclaimed,
"Ah, no good,"
and tried to grab the boy by the arm and pull him off his horse. Just at that instant, the revolver went off and shot the Indian through the breast. His grin changed to a look of painful astonishment as he fell forward on his pony's neck and wheeled out of the fight. It did not take long for the detail to reach the edge of the bluff, and as soon as they got there, the Indians on the right and left wheeled out of the way, and from the rear, they poured out such a volley from their guns and revolvers that for a little while, it reminded me of Wilson Creek or Prairie Grove battlefields. But our men were going very rapidly downhill, and the Indians, in their alarm, fired so high that they hurt our men very little, but did considerable harm to a lot of Sioux who were charging up to take the bridge. Lieutenant Collins and 4 men were killed in this fight, and nearly all of the rest were more or less wounded, though none mortally. The escape of any of them was little short of miraculous. As soon as the Cheyennes came out of their ambush, all the men upon or near the bridge had run as fast as they could to help their comrades, whom they knew would soon be striving to get back to the station. They had gotten about halfway over the bottomland when the detail came rushing down the hill, and the Indians, seeing the footmen coming, were deterred from further pursuit. Lieutenant Brittany and the party with him, as soon as they saw the Cheyennes charge, turned from the bluff and ran to the bridge as fast as they could, and they were just in time. From the deep gulch east of the bridge, about 500 Sioux had been lying in ambush, and as soon as the Cheyennes reached the top of the bluff, they came charging out to take the bridge, but seeing Brittany and the men with him, and some reinforcements that came over the bridge, pouring in the shot so lively from carbine and revolver, and the other Indians firing so high when shooting at our men who were coming over the bluff, and having the Sioux in exact range, a good many of the latter were hit, and it got so hot for them that they could not stand the pressure, but turned tail and fell back into the gulch again, about as fast as they had come out. If they had succeeded in their object of taking the bridge, they would have probably killed all of the rest of Collins's party, and about 15 or 20 others on the bottomland going to their relief, and would then very likely have captured the station also. Just as they reached the river, one of the soldiers fell, shot through the heart. The rest plunged into the stream. When about 4 rods from the opposite shore, another man was shot and fell from his horse into the river. The others reached the shore in safety and headed toward the station. Quite a number of Indians had been concealed on the south side of the river, probably in ambush, waiting for some party to go out on that side and reconnoiter, or else hoping to seize a favorable moment to rush in and surprise the station. But as soon as the train appeared, they came out of their hiding places and made for the train, most of them crossing the river below the station, but about 15 or 20 of them going south of the station toward the train. When the 3 men escaping across the river were about halfway to the station, they struck the advance of the Indians on the south side. There were only 4 or 5 of the Redskins, and the boys shot 2 before the others appeared in sight. They then turned their horses toward the mountains to the southeast, until they came to a deep ravine with some brush along the banks. Here they abandoned their horses and wound their way among the brush down into the ravine. After working down this ravine about a quarter of a mile or more, they stopped to reconnoiter a bit. The corporal crawled up to the edge of the ravine and raised his head for a peep at the surrounding country. Just as his head was exposed, a bullet plowed along the top of it, close enough to stun him for a second or two. He dropped, and the other boys pulled him back and bathed his head. This brought him to. Then they decided to move down a little further and make another investigation. The next time they looked, they could not see any Indians on that side of the river, except for 2 or 3 who were stationed on points of ground about 3/4 of a mile distant, evidently as lookouts. The boys then discovered another ravine about half a mile away that ran down to the river and was within about half a mile of the station. They concluded to make a run for this ravine. They started, and it didn't take them long to get to it. No more Indians had appeared in sight, and they began to feel safe. While they were running to the last ravine, some of us at the station had noticed them, and the instant we realized what it meant, about 15 or 20 of us started on foot to meet them and help if necessary. About the same time, 15 or 20 Indians came out of the ravine into which the boys had first gone and came charging out toward the ravine into which they had just disappeared. We all ran as fast as we could, shouting to the boys to work down the ravine and toward us as fast as possible. Soon we saw them emerge from the ravine into the open and make for us at top speed. They had advanced about halfway to us when the Indians reached the open, but we were now close enough for our rifle balls to reach the Indians. After they had fired a few shots at us, they fell back toward the train. The 3 men proved to be a corporal and 2 privates from Company H, 11th Kansas Cavalry. These were the only men who escaped from that wagon train, and it was a very close call for them. All that saved them was the desire of the Indians to be in at the plundering of the train, and the good sense they showed in abandoning their horses when they did. You may be sure they received a hearty welcome from all at the station. At the time, the party from the station sallied forth to the relief of these 3 men. About a dozen others, mounted, started from the station, crossed the bridge, and went up to the bluff where the fight with Collins's party had taken place, to bring in the bodies of the slain soldiers. They found them mangled in a shocking manner, the noble red men taking a fiendish delight in mutilating the dead bodies of their fallen foes in a way too horrible to be described. Near one of the bodies, a piece of paper was lying, which one of the men picked up. From its appearance, it was torn out of a pocket diary or account book. It was written about as follows: "I was taken prisoner about 7 months ago at Labonte Station. You must be careful, or you will all be killed. There are between 3,000 and 4,000 Indians here, and about another 1,000 expected in a day or 2. They belong to the Cheyennes, Sioux, and Arapaho, with a few Comanches and Blackfeet. You killed one of their principal chiefs, belonging to the Cheyennes, yesterday, and they swear they will have a terrible revenge on you for it. The intention is to clean out all the stations on this road and then go on to the Fort Collins Road and clean that out. I shall escape from them if I can." I do not remember the name signed to it, but it was evidently some person with the Indians who was feeling friendly toward us. Some of the 11th Ohio men thought it was a man who had belonged to one of their companies, and who was supposed to have deserted at the time he mentioned at Labonte Station. A good many of the 11th Ohio Cavalry had been recruited from the rebel soldiers who had gone into Ohio on the celebrated Morgan raid. And after their capture, they preferred enlistment in the United States Army to fight Indians rather than remain in military prisons in the North until the war should end, or until they could be exchanged. Most of them made good, faithful soldiers, but some of them were exceptionally hard cases, deserting and joining the Indians, and helping them in their warfare against the whites. What the Indians didn't know of devilment, these renegades taught them. From the roof of the station, and with the aid of a large spyglass, we had a pretty good view of what was going on at the train. It had stopped on a side hill, and with the 3 wagons, the men had formed 3 sides of a square, with one front facing up the hill to the north, one east, and one south. But the west side was open. The first Indians who came to the scene of action charged right onto the train, but they were repulsed. As others arrived, they again made a charge, but were once again driven back. After this, for a long time, there did not seem to be much action going on. Every once in a while, we could see a cloud of smoke from the wagons, or from the side hill below the wagons, which showed that the fight was still in progress, but we could not tell with what result, though we noticed that the puffs of smoke from the hillside on the south were gradually getting closer and closer, and we felt that the end could not be far off. Never in all our service as soldiers had we experienced anything like this before. To know that about 20 of our comrades, with whom for nearly 3 years we had been soldiering in the South, were now within 2.5 miles of us, surrounded by an overwhelming number of savage enemies determined on their destruction, and we not able to do anything for their relief, was heart-rending. Some of us went to Major Anderson and requested that 40 or 50 of us be allowed to volunteer and go out on foot to attempt a rescue, but the Major, while feeling deeply for the brave fellows who were making such a heroic fight against such terrible odds, realized that an attempt at relief by any who started from the bridge force would doubtless mean the destruction of the entire party. In such an event, it would have been an easy matter for the Indians to have taken the station and massacred all who were left. At that time, we thought the Major too cautious, but since then, knowing what the Indians did to the Fetterman party the next year near Fort Phil Kearny, and later to the gallant Custer and his brave men at Little Big Horn, we are satisfied that the Major's decision was a wise one, and that by it alone are any of us left alive today. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the Major ordered a party of 20 mounted men, under Lieutenant Walker, to proceed about 2 miles east of the station and repair the telegraph wire that had been cut at that point, so that we could wire to Deer Creek and other stations below, and have them send reinforcements and ammunition enough to enable us to cope with the Indians. At the same time Walker's party left, the 10 or 12 galvanized soldiers, under command of their officer, were to go out about half a mile from the station and support the cavalry under Walker on their return to the station if the Indians should develop any force that would interfere with the repairs on the telegraph wires. A set of signals had been arranged by which Lieutenant Walker was to be notified if the Indians from the west were moving back from the train and interfering with carrying out his orders. The flag at the station was to be waved if the Indians were moving toward him, and should it develop that sufficient Indians were coming to frustrate his plans, the howitzer was to be fired, and at that, Lieutenant Walker was to bring his command back to the support of the others, and all would fall back to the station. Walker arrived at the break in the telegraph wire and then sent 4 men, Sergeant McDougal and Privates Porter, Hilty, and Chappelle, about 1/4 mile to the east to watch for Indians. The others went to work joining the wire, which was broken in several places. Very soon after Walker's command left the station, it was noticed that a large number of Indians, who were on their ponies between the station and the train, had commenced moving north, and it was but a short time before they were crossing a divide about 1 mile northeast of the station. We then knew they had observed the party leaving the station, and were on their way to intercept them. The signal was thereupon given with the flag, as soon as it was positive that enough of the savages had passed to be certain it would not do to delay any longer. The howitzer was also fired as a signal for the party to come in. As soon as the report was heard, the men dropped the wires, mounted their horses, and then Walker, without waiting for the 4 men whom he had thrown out in advance, ordered the others in as fast as possible. The captain of the galvanized troops did not wait until the cavalry came up, but ordered his men back in a canter. Some of the company I boys had gone out on foot, nearly to the point where the galvanized troops had been stationed. As soon as they heard the howitzer, they ran to where the relief had been stationed, and as soon as they passed the returning galvanized troops, they cursed their captain for being a coward, for leaving his post before the cavalry had overtaken him. The captain, however, paid no attention to their jeers, but pushed on to the station, although some of his men turned back to help the others. The cavalry advanced until they overtook the boys on foot, and then most of them turned to assist the 4 men on outpost from Walker's command, although Lieutenant Walker's horse got under such headway that it didn't stop until it had carried him safely into the station without his having fired a shot. About 15 Indians had appeared out of a ravine and charged for the 4 men from the north side of the river. The men discharged their carbines and then commenced to unload their revolvers. They did not notice anything on the south. Several Indians came out of a ravine on the south close by, and before they were even observed, one of them had driven a spear into Porter's heart, and he fell dead from his horse. Another Indian gave Hilty a stab with a spear, which penetrated his lung. The savage withdrew his weapon as Hilty fell forward on his horse's neck. This Indian attempted to strike McDougal as he went by, but he was so close to the sergeant that there was not room to use his weapon effectively. McDougal turned his head, and seeing that it was an Indian who was attempting to bore him with a spear, pressed his revolver against the Indian's body and pulled the trigger. The Indian fell from his horse, shot through the heart. It was the last cartridge McDougal had in his revolver, but it saved his life. By this time, the boys on foot began to reach the Indians with their carbines, and as the Indians who had gotten into this skirmish were comparatively few in numbers, they did not press any closer. Hilty clung to his horse until it carried him into the station where he was cared for. I will state here that he eventually recovered. About the time Lieutenant Walker's party had started from the station, we observed that the firing had ceased at the train. Soon after, a large smoke arose, and we saw that the wagons were burning fiercely. We then knew that the fighting there was all over, and that the brave men who had so well defended themselves were all dead. They had made a gallant fight for 4 hours, but had been overpowered at last. The Indians hung about the place, watching the wagons burn until nearly nightfall, and then a great many of them moved back to the bluffs north of the river. We expected that during the night they would make some demonstration against the station, and the guards were doubled and extra vigilance enjoined on them, so that we would not be taken unawares. Just after midnight, a few of the savages came prowling about, but the guards were on the alert and fired at them. They responded with a few arrows, but made no further demonstration. About 10 o'clock that night, Major Anderson arranged with the half-breed Snake Indian to go to Deer Creek and report the situation to the commanding officer there, and have him telegraph down the road, and also to carry orders for the garrison at Deer Creek to march to our assistance and bring us a supply of ammunition. During the fight of the day before, we had captured a number of Indian ponies whose riders had been shot off their mounts, and which had followed along with Collins's party into our lines. The half-breed selected one of these. He started out a little after 10 o'clock, going directly south toward the mountains. And after striking them, he took a trail which he knew and worked to the east until he reached the Deer Creek station in safety. Here about 50 men of Company K, 11th Kansas Volunteers, with about 5,000 rounds of ammunition, were dispatched for Platte Bridge. The next morning, everything appeared about as it had been the previous night. The Indians were in sight on the bluff, but we noticed parties of them going off in a northwesterly direction all morning. About noon, the last of them disappeared. Toward 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we noticed a body of men coming from the direction of the Deer Creek station. They proved to be Company K with the ammunition. We gave them a hearty reception, and as soon as they had rested a few minutes, they, in company with a detachment of Company Y, started on the trail of the Indians. It was soon ascertained that the savages were in full retreat, and then the command was ordered to the spot where the wagon train had made such a gallant fight. On arriving there, a horrible sight met our gaze. 21 of our dead soldiers were lying on the ground, stripped naked and mangled in every conceivable way. I noticed one poor fellow with a wagon tire across his bowels, and from appearances, it had been heated red hot and then laid upon him, while still alive, so that the red devils might gloat over the torture they were inflicting before the breath of life had entirely left his body. From the appearance of the other bodies, I believe he was the only one tortured, and therefore, I believe he was the only one left alive at the time they captured the train. Every one of them was scalped, but the Indians had left the scalps lying around on the ground, which was a sure sign that their loss had been so heavy, they did not think they had cause to exult over their victory. We counted about 40 lodgepole trails on which they had fixed stretchers to carry off their wounded. We heard sometime after that their loss was over 60, killed and about 130 badly wounded. The loss on our side was Lieutenant Collins, and 27 men killed, 11 or 12 wounded, and 1 missing. We presume the missing man was killed, but we could not find his body. It may have been possible that the Indians captured him and carried him away to torture at one of their villages. The command returned to the station, and the next morning, we went out and buried our fellow heroes in the ground, upon which they had so nobly, yet unavailingly, fought. Most of those who had been killed with the train had belonged to Company H of the 11th Kansas, and it was always considered the best company in the regiment when there was any real fighting to be done. Yet up to this time, the company had escaped with fewer fatalities than any other company in the regiment. It seemed so much harder to bear to think that after 3 years of fighting against the rebels, they were ordered out on the plains to fight Indians, and now when the orders were out for their return home, where they were to be mustered out, they were so ruthlessly slaughtered. We have the consolation of knowing that they died with their faces to the foe, and that in death, as in their 3 years' service, they sustained the proud reputation gained by this regiment of always doing its duty, no matter what odds were pitted against them. About 2 days later, the 6th Michigan Cavalry came to relieve us at the bridge, and we marched for home without further molestation. Lieutenant William Drew, Company I, 11th Kansas Cavalry.